Welcome back to Pewpew Academy. This is Professor Pewpew, and in today's video, I'll be going over at least one useful tip for every meta weapon in the Mists. First, let me start off by saying that this video is more geared for either new PvP players or someone who's been grinding for a while but is trying to pick up a new weapon line. And if you're an experienced player, then you might or might not learn anything new from this video, and you'll probably have some tips and tricks of your own that I did not cover in this video. If that's the case, it would be wonderful if you can share some of your own tips and tricks in the comments so we can all learn together. Also, as the title suggests, this video is only going to cover what I consider to be the most meta weapons in the Mists. Now when I say meta, I mean the most used weapons, not necessarily what's most OP. But of course, a lot of the times the OP weapons are the most used weapons because they're OP. But sometimes a weapon can get a lot of use because of other factors like how easy it is to use this weapon, or is it lag friendly, or how much it costs. So those weapons will be covered as well. There are some weapons that I think are pretty strong or pretty underappreciated, but for one reason or another they're just not as popular, and we'll save weapons like that for a different video. Now let's dive in. We're talking about the Mist meta in this video, so of course we have to start with Carving Swords. Carving Sword E is a line-shaped dash, which allows you to hit your opponent while dashing away from them. This is very important for kiting. Carving Swords are not the highest DPS melee weapons out there. When you fight against something that can outbrawl you with more consistent damage, for example dual swords or one-hand daggers, it's important to remember that you can hit them with your E while dashing away, which gives them less time to trade with you, so you can build up a HP lead before you go all in for the kill. In some cases, it can also punish players for being too hungry and trying too hard to chase you down. Sometimes a player with an IP advantage or a weapon advantage will go all in on you, thinking they can just walk you over with their advantage. Then hitting them with an E while dashing away and rooting them with a W is a good way to do some damage while running. And if they let you do this enough times, then they won't have that advantage that made them so confident anymore. Next up is Great Hammer. Great Hammers are benefiting a lot from the release of the Avalonian Cape. In combination with Stalker Jacket, Great Hammers will straight up one combos and lower IP players. In even IP fights, Great Hammers usually wants to play around the cooldown of their Stalker Jacket. The idea is to go in when Stalker Jacket is up and run away when the Stalker Jacket is down and wait for cooldowns to do it again. When you're playing this way, make sure you keep in mind that both your E and your W are line-shaped AoEs just like the Carving Sword E, so you can hit your enemy with it while you're dashing away. And if you do this, you will open up a lot more distance between you and him than if you were to just use the dash to get away from them. If you actually apply the slow or the stun, it makes it a lot harder for them to chase you. Great Hammer's Qs can do a lot of damage for a Q skill, so sometimes it's okay to just sit there and trade Qs and autos with someone, and you don't always have to play around the Stalker Jacket cooldown that way. The important thing is to just make sure you dodge the damage on their Ws and Es, because the Great Hammer's Ws and Es don't do a whole lot of damage, right? So as long as you can dodge their Qs and E, or their Ws and Es, then you can win the trade with just autos and Qs. And that way, you'll be able to close out the fights a lot faster, which is pretty important in the Mist, because if the fight drags on, then there's more chances for people to third party and rat you, and there are also more chances for people to just disengage and run away from you if they realize that they're disadvantaged. Double-bladed staves are probably the best meta weapon for dismounting people, which makes them great for bullying low IP players. This is why they're probably the most hated weapon in the Mist meta right now. Double-bladed staves are played very similarly as Great Hammers. The general idea of the build is to go in when your Stalker Jacket is up, and run away when your Stalker Jacket is down. So just like with a Great Hammer, keep in mind that it's, you'll open up a lot more distance when you're kiting if you actually hit your opponent with your stun run than if you were to just spam stun run for the movement speed. This should be pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how many times I see people die on double-bladed staff because they're not actually using the stun part of their stun run. Also, don't use your W if you don't have to. A lot of times you can win a trade with just your E and your jacket. So it'll be better if you can save your W to, let's say, cancel out a part of their boots duration. You'll get a lot more value out of your stun if you stun them when they're trying to do something than if you were to just spam it at them randomly. So for example, if you fight against a one-hand dagger and you stun them during their E, or if you fight against someone that has a merc jacket and you stun them while they have merc jacket up, that stun becomes a lot more useful than if you were to just spam it at them randomly. Next up, we have the Battle Axe. Battle Axe is a weapon that can punch above its weight class, and therefore they're really popular with newer players. When playing the Battle Axe, you should know that while you can take on a lot of builds in face-to-face fights, it doesn't always mean that you want to. If you do some kiting first by landing your E's, you can win a lot of otherwise difficult fights. Also keep in mind that the damage output with a one-hand axe is much higher if you never use the third charge of your Q or the second charge of your E. You really only want to use the third charge of your Q if you need the root to chase someone down or to hold them still so you can land your E's. Your second part of your E is really only good for the healing. The damage on it is not that great. So if you're just going for the damage, it'd be better if you just let the E time out and use only the first part of your E. Next up is Baton Bow. In my opinion, Baton is the only bow that is decent for the mist. The other bows have a much harder time dismounting people and finishing kills through undead capes. Baton bows can both dismount and finish kills, and it has some extra utilities in its E skill. Baton E interrupts casting and channels, which is useful for dealing with fire staffs or cultist ropes. And against melees, the AoE on the Baton Bow E provides an extra way for you to kite. If you hit someone with a Warbow E, for example, they take some damage and that's it. But if you hit someone with a Baton Bow E, it creates an AoE which will do a lot of damage to the other player if they sit in it. So when you're kiting against a melee player who engaged on you, you can just hit them with an E and sit inside the circle. This forces them to walk away from you, which opens up space for you to kite. Deathgiver suffered some recent nerfs, but they're still very much in meta, and there are a lot of little tricks when it comes to playing this weapon, but a very useful one that not a lot of players seem to know is how to counter Hunterhood with Shadow Edge. Shadow Edge is a fixed duration iframe, meaning if you land the skill, you're invulnerable to all damage and all crowd control for a set duration. I'm not exactly sure how long this duration is, it's not a part of the skill description, but I can tell you that it's pretty damn long for a iframe. Long enough for you to land your W, fly to your target, and cast another ability while you're still invulnerable. In other words, if someone tries to reflect your E with Hunterhood by turning on Hunterhood right when you hit 3 stacks, then you can just hit a Shadow Edge first, and then E, and you will not take any damage from the Hunterhood. I explained this mechanic in a short video in more detail, and you can find the link to that video in the descriptions. Next, let's talk about curses. There are several different curse staffs that are seeing a lot of use right now, but the most popular one is definitely the one-hand curse. When playing both as and against the one-hand curse, it's important to know that the duration of the E is exactly 5 seconds. It doesn't say this clearly in the tooltips, but it's 5 seconds. So that means for the curse players, you can cast your E on your opponent when you have 2 Q stacks on them, and you have time to put another 2 stacks up before the E pops. Also, since we know exactly when the E is going to pop, that means we know exactly when the opponent is going to try to iframe it. This is really important when you're playing against dagger players, because they'll always try to hit you with a Shadow Edge right before the pop, so make sure you dodge that Shadow Edge. Moving on to fire staffs, one-hand fire and wildfire are both seeing some use right now, especially the wildfire that E just hits like a truck, and if your opponent is not careful, they can lose the fight even with a lot of IP advantage. When playing the wildfire, it's super important that you land the E, which is pretty difficult if your opponent is far away or they have a lot of movement speed. So to make it easier for you to land the E, especially against melees, you can hit the firewall on them first. The firewall applies fear, which makes them walk directly away from you, so it makes their movement predictable and makes your E easier to land. If you're not using firewall against melees, the fire artillery skill can act kind of like a firewall. If you get a tick of it off, you just stand on the AoE that you created, and they'll be forced to walk away from you or just die in your fire. And finally, we're gonna talk about Frost. The One-Hand Frost and Chill House are both in meta right now, and there are a few different ways to build them. And they're all super cancer to fight against if you're using any kind of melee weapons. When you're playing as a Frost, the best advice I can give you if you're new to the weapon is to practice the timing of the iframe on your W for dodging things such as Curse E's. Also, keep in mind that the W actually interrupts people if you hit them with it, so when fighting Fire Staffs with Fire Artillery or Frost Staff with Cultist Robes, just keep in mind that you can interrupt those with your W if your other interrupts are on cooldown. Also, since your auto attacks can root people on every third hit, savvy Frost players can use their auto attacks to cancel dash skills such as the double-bladed staff's E. It takes some good ping and mind reading to do this, but it's really crazy when you pull it off. So that wraps it up for this video, and in the next video we're gonna go more in detail with some beginner-friendly builds. Instead of going one tip for every weapon in the meta, I'll probably do one tip against every weapon in the meta as a specific build. So if you haven't done so already, make sure you gank that like button for me, and make sure you're subbed to the channel so you don't miss out on the new videos. And special thanks to all the people whose clips I used for making this video. I'll have the links to their channels in the descriptions below. I'll see you guys in the next one.